Thanks everybody. Welcome very much to our conference, Trust and the Smart City. This is the final event really of a project we've been running for the last couple of years or so, Trust and the Smart City, funded by Hong Kong Baptist University, faculty niche research area. Thanks go, of course, to the funders. Thanks go to the participants. Today, in a sense, it's reporting back. All of the work packages of our project will be reporting back to some extent on their reflections on this complicated issue of trust and the smart city. But we won't be limited to our internal Hong Kong Baptist University. We're also very privileged to have a rich set of speakers from elsewhere within Hong Kong, from HKUST, from Chinese U, from Education University. And we're especially delighted to have a broad international panel for the final round table from the United States, from Germany, from France, as well, of course, as from Hong Kong. So we're delighted that you could all take the time to be with us today, wherever you find yourself in the world. Let me, in a sense, these are my welcoming comments. Our real discussion of our findings of our project will be in the next session, so I'll be quite brief here, but I do want to say something about our project. The project links, if we want to sum it up, we could say the project links debates over trust that have particular purchase at the level of urban politics to the question of the smart city. So it tries to link trust and the smart city. Two rather different dimensions, perhaps, two rather different angles, mobilizing different sets of scholars. We try in this project to bring those dimensions together. Of course, as any good academic, we'd like to start with some definitions, and without going too much into the definitional morass, we could say that trust is one of the most contested and even nebulous concepts in contemporary academic research. We're not going to have time to say much about this here, except to note, as Levy does, that trust is not one thing, it does not have one source, it has a variety of forms and causes. And in the paper that accompanies this, I focus really on I suppose, three dimensions, although there are clearly others: levels of trust, properties of trust, and types of trust that are relevant for linking trust with technology. If we talk about levels, we typically talk of individual or intermediate or institutional levels of trust. If we talk about properties of trust, then the classic triptych in the literature is honesty, benevolence, competence. Those human-like qualities are sometimes applied to technology itself, of course. And then if we talk about types of trust, there are many, but in this paper, I'll report back some headline findings from the survey we carried out. We entertained notions of characteristic trust, data trust, trust in intermediaries, and trust in providers. Smart city, again, smart city is a city that uses information and communication technologies to enhance the quality and performance of urban services. I think we might say it's an essentially contested concept, but it's certainly open to contrasting interpretations, understandings, and methodologies. The phrase smart city has an uncertain parentage, we might say, but it was certainly employed in the book The Technopolis Phenomenon in 1992, and it's been used in different concepts ever since.
Thank you.
Centered very much around the presence of ICT, used to enhance efficiency and address city development challenges. Now, in our understanding of smart city is not purely a technical exercise, but it places citizens' quality of life, environmental sustainability, and human value within the smart city concept, in addition to pure technology. And I think this is something that will come back in the various papers today. There's still, however, no real definition of what a smart city consists of. My talented research assistant, Calvin, who will present to you later, has been drilling down into this, and he's developed quite a sophisticated index of smart city indexes and also of meaning. So he'll talk to you about that later. That's his definition. I'll give you Calvin's definition of smart city. A smart city is an authority using different types of information and communication technologies, including digital devices, sensors for data collection, and Internet of Things, so that beside promoting the city in a digital world and ensuring cybersecurity, the 6 dimensions of economy, mobility, environment, people, living, and governance can be improved. That's quite a mouthful, but every word is clearly weighed there, and particularly the last 6, which correspond to the Hong Kong government's smart city blueprint. So let me move on somewhat. Why link trust in the smart city? Well, I suppose this was the original question. And trust lies at the heart of debates concerning contemporary governance. It's very fluid, but people converge to acknowledge that trust is extremely important for public policy. The OECD argued that governments cannot function effectively without the trust of citizens, nor can they successfully carry out public policies, notably more ambitious reform agendas. So in our framing, well, certainly when I was conceptualizing this project at the beginning, I was thinking, rather than primarily involving a set of narrow technical issues, debates over trust in the smart city, they get to the heart of the public sphere. They involve public-private interactions, transnational learning, public debates, ethical dilemmas. These are all issues that are present in our project, and these are all matters of interdisciplinary social scientific inquiry. So those wicked questions, in a way, we try and adapt in our project. We adopted, by and large, there are 4 work packages. They're all a bit different. I'll come on to say a little bit about that in a minute. I suppose we could say a multiple method approach. I'm always a bit dubious about saying mixed methods, but anyway, certainly a multiple method approach to understanding trust in the smart city. In the survey that we carried out, very much we were talking about trust in terms of interaction with technology in general and smart city in particular. And I will present now a very short bit of information on 4 dimensions: characteristic trust, data trust, trust in intermediaries of the smart city, and access and trust in government. Now, in a sense, more important than going back to the findings of that, which are on the work, on the PowerPoint, because we carried out a survey. Let me say something a bit more about the different work packages that we'll be reporting back to you today. They're all described in the project Trust in the Smart City, although of course each group of researchers has been doing many other things as well, and embedding those questions in broader projects and lines of inquiry. I think really when I was drawing up the proposal, in my mind there were 2 different clusters, really, or types of investigation. The first one was really looking at smart city, in a sense, as a technical enterprise, but also trying to see how popular, in a sense, participatory dimensions could work within this rather technical enterprise. And so we looked at smart city, smart energy grids. It's very much Daphne's team, and we'll be reporting back on this later. And also we set out, one of the work packages we set out to look at was quite specific. It was the Hong Kong Smart Identity Card. In actual fact, we broadened out much broader than that. Undoubtedly, we could have just talked about the Hong Kong Smart ID card, but in practice we talked about many other things, more generally smart government, which I'll come back and talk about. And the second coupling of cases were a little bit different. Work package 3 was really, and this is the package based on the public factory, which Emily Tran will talk about. The idea here was much more to try and talk about the participatory co-construction dimensions of smart city, which came across very strongly when I was working with the Leading Cities organization. And we're very happy to have Mike Lake with us today, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Leading Cities organization based in Boston in the US. But when Mike was talking very much about the importance of participatory co-construction in smart city. And then our political philosophers, of course, Kevin Ip has been engaged in some dynamic work really on understanding the ethical underpinnings of the smart city and big data. So these are sort of different types, in a way, of investigation, but they're all linked by this theme, trust and the smart city. I think we can say that the the themes there are linked, and in a way we were, and again I'm careful not to say mixed methods, but nonetheless we were engaging in different types of inquiry really in this project, each representing perhaps a slightly different intellectual and methodological tradition. We carried out a mass survey. Well, we didn't carry it out. The survey organisation PORI carried out for us a mass survey, a Hong Kong-wide survey, a representative survey with 808 respondents. That's in a sense the article in one of the journal articles we've got coming out reports that in some detail. But we also did a bit more than that. We carried out a set of contextual interviews, or actually a purposive interview sample, I think we could say. We carried out 25 of those interviews. We carried out interviews, 25 or so, and when we had the permission, of course, we looked at that data, and we of course respecting confidentiality totally. But we were interested in finding out some of the trends using NVivo, and I'll report back on that in my session in a bit. Then we also carried out focus groups. This was earlier on, well, towards the end of last year. We had 4 focus groups, and Dionysus Stivas will report back on the findings of the focus groups we carried out towards the end of last year. And then finally, we were going to carry out what we called open walked event-based experiments. And this was to, in a sense, to consolidate the collaboration with our friends and colleagues in Lyon in France. So the idea was that the French would come to us and we would go to France, and we would walk out in the street, stop people and ask them what they thought about the smart city. We couldn't do that for reasons that I don't really have to make explicit, I don't think. We couldn't do that because of the pandemic. We certainly hope to be able to do that at some time in the future. But we did nonetheless carry out other parts of the public factory, which Emily will talk about, and notably the cooperation and the collaboration between our French and our Hong Kong students working on precise issues together with stakeholders. So that's essentially what we were doing in this project. As a set of different questions, really. This is a bit more formal, so it's the same thing really. We carried out 25 oral and written semi-structured interviews. We talked to former government officials, elected representatives of local authorities, economic stakeholders, academics, community leaders, more informal groups. Then we carried out, we had some additional value in a sense. Oh goodness me, my skills in I can't see myself when I'm. It's okay. I always say this with my students. It's true that when you get the little box, you can't see the screen. Doesn't matter. We also carried out. We had some extra value in a sense because we recruited Calvin Lai as one of our research assistants, and Calvin got very heavily involved in the Smart City Index, which he'll report back on. So in a sense, this is placing Hong Kong in much more of a comparative perspective and trying to see, in a way, how well is Hong Kong doing, but on the basis of an exhaustive exploration of the various smart city indexes and the elaboration, indeed, of a new smart city index, which is Calvin's been involved with. We carried out our survey. It was a sample size of 808 respondents with Hong Kong residents, conducted by PORI. That took place about a year ago. I think it was a successful survey. Certainly, anyway, we'll refer at various stages in today's dealings to this survey. Let me just finish off actually with saying one or two brief things about the survey before handing over to other members of the group. In a way, the survey, there's a lot in that survey. I don't know how many questions there were about 25 altogether, plus all the demographics. So there was a lot in there. We also had, thanks in part to my colleague Emily Tran, we were able to get a special issue of the journal China Perspectives on our project. Most of us have pieces in that, assuming that they get past the rigors of peer review, of course. My piece in that, and thanks again to Darren, who's also another research assistant who helped us to get some of the stats together. But really in that we talk about, I suppose, 4 different takes on trust on the smart city: characteristic trust, data trust, trust in the intermediaries of smart city, and trust in government. I'll come back to talk about some of these findings in my second presentation on smart government, but let me just say something very briefly here. Characteristic trust. We define the literature defines characteristic trust as that trust that's underpinned by social similarities, ethnicity, gender. Zucker affirms the greater the number of social similarities, the more interactions assume that common background expectations do exist, hence trust can be relied upon. There's a lot on this. We have to be a little bit careful how we use it. But I think coming back to our project, one of our conclusions really was that characteristic trust, there doesn't appear to be massively striking differences in relation to the smart city, at least, between gender, professional occupation, income, religious belief, or locality. However, age, cohort in particular, place of birth, and political loyalty do appear actually to be significant indicators in some respects to attitudes towards the smart city. Now, again, we drill down a bit more detail on a couple of the questions, Q11 and Q12 of the survey. Q11, which of the following cities do you think are doing the best in terms of the smart city? We put Hong Kong there, of course, but we also put Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore, Shenzhen, and another one, I think. And then we had Q12, which was to ask people if they would be proud if Hong Kong was recognised as one of the top smart cities in the world. Now, when we look at this, and again, Calvin will talk about this in his presentation a bit, so I won't say too much. But if we look at the sort of the core Hong Konger who is proud of the development of Hong Kong as a smart city, then it's a citizen who has a high degree of public trust in the government, is supported by and large of government. The demographic is tending to be someone who's slightly older, perhaps slightly less educated, probably more pro-establishment in terms of the politics, possibly being born in mainland China, because a lot of our survey, about 35% of the survey was actually born in mainland China, probably being retired. So if you like, it's the kernel of the cluster of Hong Kong citizens who support the evolution of Hong Kong as a smart city in the strongest sense. Calvin will present some of the findings. Those who were more suspicious, perhaps, or less enthusiastic tended to be younger cohorts. They tended to look to other cities like Tokyo or Taipei as being, in a sense, models of what a smart city should be, tending to be perhaps rather more educated. So that was an interesting finding. Then in terms of data trust, and again, I'll be very, very brief here. But what we find, and that's sort of, I'm just saying in a sense that, so in a sense, there is this strong relation between supporting development in Hong Kong into a smart city and supporting the government. But when we look to the Smart City Blueprint, which is the key document organising the Hong Kong government's smart city policy, we see a few things going on. We see in that map there's lots of red on it. The red means that people don't really understand the Hong Kong Smart City Blueprint. And if we look at that, how well do you understand the contents of the Smart City Blueprint, then the red appears to be quite overwhelming in many respects. And I think there's a genuine difficulty here that in terms of the public policy, the Smart City Blueprint was not seen to be particularly visible or incomprehensible. Whereas in terms of the different distinctive elements of a public policy, mobility, living, people, environment, there's a very strong support for the individual elements of the smart city, but the policy as a whole did not appear to have a particularly strong public recognition. And I guess this is a bit of a difficult, this is a challenge for a technical public discourse, because there's a proud record in the field of digital services in Hong Kong, and I'll talk about that in my later presentation. But this does not automatically transform itself into a convincing public message. And I think there's a tension. There's a tension between this proud, sophisticated population, very at ease in many senses with technology, but not necessarily buying into perhaps the public message that's being put across. There's some evidence in the survey here. We talk about different policies like Leave Home Safe app or smart lampposts. I won't come into these too much, but in a sense that we see the same sort of dynamics, that there's something going on with age, there's something going on with education, there's also something going on with the politics of all of this. There's a very brief map there which shows quite a strong correlation really between political positions that were expressed in the survey and attitudes towards some of the more obvious questions like do I welcome it if government collects my personal data to improve its services? So we see quite a distinct display of different positions on that one. So I think, in a sense, moving on, in terms of the intermediaries of the smart city, I won't say too much here, but who delivers public services? How much should groups in civil society be involved in the smart city? What's the attitude towards providers of public services? We carried out some survey questions here. A little bit difficult to say too much in this presentation about this, except to say that the notion of trustworthiness is clearly important here. It refers to the honesty, integrity and benevolence with which services are provided, in a sense. And in terms of asking Hong Kong citizens who they preferred really to deliver these smart city services, then maybe predictably there's a strong support for community organisations and civic associations, for locally funded companies, perhaps a bit less for foreign funded companies or public-private partnerships. And then some of the district councils, the Hong Kong government, the legislative council were not necessarily deemed to be necessarily the most appropriate providers of smart city services. We talked about trust in the government. We talked about trust in the government not because we wanted to find out whether people trusted the government, but we wanted to find out whether, in a sense, the question trust in the smart city is a bit of a proxy really for other beliefs like a mistrust of government, a trust in technology per se, trust in providers, trust in technology as process. And I think we sort of concluded with, well, I think we concluded with, although we haven't concluded yet really, but we have a series of questions that need to be answered, obviously, and some of them we've had a stab at answering. Smart city, if we go back to that initial question, it probably requires a diffuse, what I call thin trust. Now, a thin trust, it's not necessarily something that's deeply adhered to by citizens, but it's a general belief in the sort of integrity, the competence, and the honesty of policymakers or public policies. So, to be successful, I think, to share data, and we'll come back to this later, then smart city and smart city applications probably need to have that thin trust to underpin them. And if Hong Kong is to be developed into a smart city, then clearly it needs to build on that diffuse sense of thin trust. We see, of course, a strong correlation between support for the government and the development of Hong Kong as a smart city, which does not mean, of course, that everybody supports the government or indeed that everybody supports Hong Kong as a smart city. Well, I'll present some more on that later. I've been speaking actually for 25 minutes, which I think is enough for me. We won't take any questions for this introduction. However, the questions that you might want to ask about this introduction can be carried over, in a sense, to our next session. And unless there are any really pressing questions that Calvin has for me, because we need to sort of move on a little bit, if that's okay. So, colleagues and actually friends and students and everybody out there, thank you very much. This is my conclusion. Sorry, I forgot that bit. Very quickly, what do we identify? We identify a bit of we call this a data trust paradox. High support for technology in Hong Kong, in some senses a low trust environment comparatively speaking. We see there's some sort of social impact of trust and mistrust, correlations with age, political affiliation. We see that clearly, something else is going on apart from the smart city. And I think this is a problem of, I've also, in addition to the survey, I've also written a piece on urban narratives. We have a book coming out on urban narratives. And I think one of the difficulties actually of smart city as an urban narrative is it's quite difficult to embody what it sets out to describe. It blurs some of the other, perhaps more fundamental dynamics of the city. So that this smart city, it can, and this, I think this is a theme that comes out, technology can be sincerely adhered to. But technology as an urban narrative, just to finish up in this more constructive dimension, is quite difficult to mobilize people on the basis of technology as a narrative. We can certainly talk about that later. So I think in a way, that's all I want to say for the moment, and we're going to move on, I believe, to our next, the next part, and so I'll hand over actually to the chair of the next session. Our next session is being chaired. That's the end. Thanks very much.